What happens when a family disappears without losing a single person? Numbers 27 begins with a dead man, Zelophehad, but the real crisis is what his death seems to mean for the living. He has no sons. Under the inheritance pattern being formed for Israel, that omission could erase his household's claim to land, and with it his remembered place among the tribes. The 5 daughters carry names the text refuses to let vanish: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. Their father belonged to the clan of Hepher, within the tribe of Manasseh. He had died in the wilderness, and the passage gives no indication that he was part of Korah's rebellion or that he left behind some hidden offense. His death was ordinary in one sense. Its legal consequence was not. Their case was brought before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the tribal leaders, and the whole congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting. This was not a private dispute settled beside a family doorway. It reached the place where Israel's authority, worship, and public memory met. The daughters stood before the nation because the question involved more than property. It involved whether their father would still have a place in the future God had promised. Their request was direct. They asked why their father's name should be removed from his clan because he had no son. They did not claim that he deserved special favor. They appealed to the purpose of inheritance itself. If land was assigned by ancestral family, then a household without sons should not automatically become a household without a name. Their words expose a gap in the system before anyone explains how to close it. Moses did not answer from instinct, custom, or personal authority. Numbers 27 says he brought their case before the Lord. That detail is easy to pass over, but it changes the entire scene. The issue was not resolved by assuming that tradition was already complete. A living dispute forced Israel to ask whether the law, as understood, truly served the covenant purpose of preserving families within the land. The ruling follows with unusual clarity. If a man dies and has no son, his inheritance is to pass to his daughter. If there is no daughter, it goes to his brothers. If there are no brothers, to his father's brothers. If those are absent, it goes to the nearest relative in his clan. The text then says this becomes a statute for Israel. The daughter's case becomes a rule for future households. That is the consequence. Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah do not merely receive an exception written beside their father's name. Their appeal becomes part of the nation's legal memory. Scripture preserves both the names of the women and the process by which their claim was heard. Their household enters Israel's future through a ruling made because they refused to let silence decide the matter. Yet this was not a modern property system, and the passage does not erase every limit placed on women in ancient Israel. Inheritance remained tied to clan, tribe, land, and family continuity. The text does not describe a general transfer of power from men to women. It records something more precise and perhaps more disruptive. Daughters could become the recognized heirs of their father's portion when no son existed. That precision carries its own emotional weight. The daughters were not asking for wealth detached from memory. They were asking that their father's name remain attached to a place. In a world where land connected a household to its ancestors, its work, its worship, and its future, losing the inheritance could mean more than losing fields. It could mean becoming unrooted, absorbed into another family, and remembered only as a branch that ended. Numbers 27 therefore moves from one family's grief into the architecture of Israel itself. The book of Numbers is filled with censuses, tribal names, camps, journeys, deaths, and boundaries. At first, those lists can feel like administrative records, but beneath them lies a question that touches every tent. Who will still be counted when the wilderness generation is gone? Israel is standing on the plains of Moab, east of the Jordan, within sight of the land it has not yet entered. The people have lived for years with portable walls, gathered bread, tribal standards, and the constant movement of a camp. Now the future is being organized. Families are counted. Tribal portions will be assigned. The promise is becoming an inheritance with boundaries. That is why Zelophehad's death matters at this moment. The land is not treated as an ordinary commodity that can simply be bought, sold, and forgotten. In the biblical account, it is connected to the covenant between God and Israel, and to the family through whom each portion is received. Historical comparisons from the ancient Near East show that land, lineage, and household identity were often closely linked, though the exact practices varied across societies. Numbers presents Israel's arrangement as accountable to God. Moses stands at the center of that arrangement, but Numbers 27 also shows the limits of his role. He is the mediator who receives the case, yet he is not permitted to manufacture the answer. The daughters come to him, and he brings their dispute before the Lord. Authority here is not ownership of the household's future. It is responsibility to hear the case, preserve justice, and submit even a difficult question to the God who gives the inheritance. The Lord's answer is direct. The daughters of Zelophehad speak right. Their claim becomes law. If a man dies without a son, his inheritance passes to his daughter, keeping the family's name and portion within Israel's covenant order. Numbers 27 does not end with a private ruling. The decision had to be carried into the land itself. Moses recorded the principle, but Joshua would face the harder question. Would the inheritance actually reach the daughters when Israel crossed the Jordan and divided Canaan? That process was not left to personal memory. Joshua 17 names the 5 daughters of Zelophehad, and the text identifies them as belonging to the clans of Manasseh, son of Joseph. They approached Eleazar the priest, Joshua, and the leaders at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Their claim had moved from a wilderness dispute into the public administration of Israel's future. The location matters. The entrance of the tent was not merely a convenient meeting place. It marked the point where national decisions stood before God's presence. Land allotment involved tribal leaders, priestly oversight, and the memory of the ruling given through Moses. The daughters were not asking for a private favor. They were presenting a recorded claim before the authorities responsible for distributing the covenant inheritance. Joshua 17 says that the leaders recognized the instruction Moses had received. The daughters were given an inheritance among their father's brothers. Scripture does not describe the boundaries of each portion or tell us how they managed the land afterward. It does tell us the essential outcome. Their father's name did not disappear from the clan, and his share did not vanish simply because his household had no son. That is the consequence of Numbers 27 in the historical shape of Joshua. A legal principle became a field, a boundary, and a place where a family could remain attached to the land. The passage does not claim that every property system in Israel became equal in every respect. It shows something more precise. Within the covenant structure, daughters could stand as heirs when the normal male line was absent. For the 5 women named in Numbers, this must have changed the meaning of their father's death. Zelophehad was no longer only the man who had died in the wilderness. He remained connected to a portion of the land promised to Israel. His daughters carried his name into the settlement. Their inheritance was not merely wealth. It preserved family memory in a society where land, lineage, and belonging were tightly joined. Yet Joshua 17 also reminds us that a legal victory did not erase every boundary. The daughters' inheritance remained tied to Manasseh. Numbers 36 later addresses the concern that if they married outside the tribe, the land might pass into another tribal possession. The solution required them to marry within their father's tribe. The ruling opened a door, but it also placed that door inside Israel's wider concern for tribal land. That tension prepares the way for another biblical household, one shaped by famine, widowhood, migration, and loss. The book of Ruth does not retell Numbers 27, and Scripture never says that Ruth was applying the daughter's ruling. The connection is more careful than that. Both stories ask what happens when death threatens a family's name, land, and place among the people. Ruth begins in Bethlehem, where Elimelech leaves with Naomi and their 2 sons during a famine. In Moab, Elimelech dies. Then the sons, Mahlon and Chilion, also die, leaving Naomi and Ruth without husbands. Naomi returns to Bethlehem with Ruth, but the household that once carried a husband's name and 2 sons has been reduced to 2 widows seeking a place to survive. The world they enter is the world of fields, harvests, gates, and remembered family claims. Ruth gathers leftover grain behind the reapers, an allowance connected to Israel's laws for the poor, the foreigner, the widow, and the fatherless. The text does not present this as sentimental charity alone. It is a commanded form of access to the land's harvest, though the safety and dignity of those who gathered depended heavily on the conduct of landowners and workers. Boaz becomes important because he is described as a relative of Elimelech and as a man of standing. In Ruth, the threatened household is not restored through inheritance law alone. It requires a relative willing to act. This introduces the idea of redemption, a family member using his position and resources to recover what has been placed under pressure by death, debt, or dispossession. The Hebrew term, often translated as redeemer, refers to a near relative with family responsibilities. It does not mean a magical rescuer, and the Bible does not reduce the role to one simple legal procedure. In Ruth 4, Boaz must deal with the land associated with Elimelech and with the future of Naomi's family line. Another relative has the first opportunity, but he declines when the arrangement threatens his own inheritance. At the town gate, where elders witnessed agreements, Boaz completes the matter publicly. Ruth becomes his wife, and she bears Obed, the father of Jesse and grandfather of David. The genealogy at the end of Ruth widens a fragile household story into Israel's royal history. Redemption has not erased the deaths of Elimelech, Mahlon, or Chilion. It has carried the family's memory forward through a Moabite widow whose place in the household was not obvious at the beginning. That movement matters because Numbers 27 does not merely preserve property. It makes inheritance a responsibility toward the living, the dead, and generations still waiting for a place within God's household. The ruling in Numbers 27 did not create a private exception for 5 women and then disappear. It became part of Israel's public law. If a man died without a son, his inheritance could pass to his daughter, then to his brothers, his father's brothers, and finally to the nearest relative in his clan. Zelophehad's family had entered the legal memory of the nation. That decision also reached beyond the courtroom. In Joshua 17, the daughters of Zelophehad appear again before Eleazar the priest, Joshua, and Israel's leaders. They receive their portion among the descendants of Manasseh, exactly as the Lord had commanded through Moses. The record is brief, but its meaning is concrete. Their names were attached to actual land. The 5 daughters did not become symbols detached from ordinary life. Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah needed fields, boundaries, and a recognized place among their people. Their claim preserved a father's name, but it also secured the household's future. A decision made in the wilderness became visible in the settled inheritance of Canaan. That is where the emotional force of the passage changes. At first, the issue seems to be whether daughters may inherit. By the time Joshua records the outcome, the deeper question is whether a family can remain present in the land after death, displacement, and the loss of a male heir. The answer is yes, but not because loss was denied. It was answered through belonging. From here, the reading must widen. Numbers 27 is not a modern declaration that every ancient social boundary had vanished. The text still operates within tribal clans, male-headed lines, and land held as a covenant trust. But neither is it accurate to read the chapter as though daughters were invisible within that system. The written law names them, hears them, and changes the procedure because their case exposes a gap. The setting matters. Israel's inheritance was being organized before the people possessed the land in full. A census counted families by tribe and clan, while Moses stood on the edge of the Jordan, seeing the territory he would not enter. The future was being measured before it could be occupied. In that uncertain moment, 5 names forced the law to account for a household the census could not ignore. Reading the chapter closely reveals a pattern of preservation. Scripture does not preserve only the names of kings, priests, and warriors. It preserves the names of women whose legal appeal altered how inheritance would work. Their names appear in Numbers 26, Numbers 27, Numbers 36, and Joshua 17. Repetition is evidence. The family was not mentioned once and forgotten. In Israel, a family was more than a private emotional unit. It was connected to ancestry, labor, worship, protection, and land. Inheritance meant receiving a share of the promise and carrying responsibility for it. The word does not simply describe wealth passed from one generation to another. It describes a place within the people, tied to memory and duty. That system explains why the dispute in Numbers 36 followed the ruling in Numbers 27. Leaders from Manasseh feared that land awarded to Zelophehad's daughters could pass through marriage into another tribe. The concern was not that the daughters had received too much. The concern was that tribal boundaries might be weakened. The solution required them to marry within their father's clan. The earlier family appears only briefly in this later law, and that restraint matters. The text does not tell us how the 5 women felt about the restriction, nor does it describe their marriages. What it records is a negotiated balance. Their inheritance was recognized, and the tribal structure was protected. Scripture gives us the decision, while leaving some human details unresolved. That unresolved space prevents an easy reading. Numbers 27 opened a door, but Numbers 36 shows that the doorway stood inside an ancient household system with limits and competing responsibilities. The daughters were not removed from the structure. They were given a defined place within it. Their claim became law without turning Israel's entire inheritance system into something else. The consequence reached the land itself. A field was not merely an asset that could be sold and replaced elsewhere. Under Israel's covenant arrangement, land marked the family's place in the promise. Leviticus 25 presents the land as belonging ultimately to God, with Israel dwelling on it as tenants under divine authority. That is why permanent loss carried such weight. Joshua 17 therefore records more than an administrative transfer. It shows the law arriving at a boundary, a parcel, and a community. The daughters received what had been promised to their father's household, while Manasseh retained its tribal inheritance. The written decision survived the wilderness, crossed into Canaan, and became visible in the distribution of the land. Numbers 27 changed the daughters' place in Israel because it made their belonging legally legible. They did not need a son to make their father's memory count. They did not need their household to vanish before another family could inherit its future. Their petition became part of the nation's reading of justice, land, and covenant responsibility. A parcel of land could hold a family's name long after its members were gone. For Zelophehad's daughters, the question was not only where they would live, it was whether their father would still have a place in Israel's future, or whether his household would disappear at the edge of the promised land. That is why the decision carried more than financial value. Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah received recognition within the covenant community, while Numbers 36 protected Manasseh's tribal boundaries. The ruling held 2 concerns together. A family must be remembered, and the land must remain ordered within Israel. The long-term consequence was a legal principle recorded for the whole nation. Numbers 27 did not merely solve one dispute. It established that when a man died without sons, his inheritance could pass to his daughter. A household's future could continue through women, even within a system organized around tribal descent. The rule did not erase every limit placed on women in ancient Israel, and it did not create modern equality by implication. But it did make one fact impossible to ignore. The daughters were not passive objects of inheritance. Their action brought a question before Moses, and the resulting judgment became part of Israel's public law. The human aftermath would have been quiet, almost invisible. No monument needed to announce the change. A daughter could now stand at the boundary of her family's land, know that the record recognized her claim, and understand that her father's name had not vanished simply because he had no son. That mattered to the wider community as well. Land assignments affected homes, work, harvests, marriage arrangements, and the memory carried by succeeding generations. A ruling made in the wilderness could shape decisions in Canaan, where Joshua distributed territory and families had to live with the boundaries written into Israel's covenant order. The aftershock reaches beyond Zelophehad's household. In Joshua 17, the daughters appear again in the history of Manasseh's inheritance. In Ruth 4, redemption is tied to land, family name, and the duty to preserve what might otherwise be lost. These passages do not repeat one law mechanically, but together they show how property and belonging were joined. The record also changes how we read Moses. He does not settle the dispute by personal instinct. He brings the case before God, and the judgment is then preserved in Scripture. Authority, in this moment, is accountable to a question raised by a vulnerable household. The law is not weakened by being tested. Its purpose becomes clearer. Yet one question remains beyond the record. We cannot determine how often Israel applied this provision, or how consistently daughters in other families secured the same outcome. Scripture gives us the named petition, the ruling, and its place in the law. It does not give us every household that lived under it. In the law's quiet list, 5 names remain: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. Their father's household did not vanish when his sons were absent. It remained written, remembered, and carried forward by daughters who refused to let the family name disappear into the wilderness.